Are open.
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. We're just going to let folks stream in. Thank you so much for coming. Hey, Astead.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hey, sorry. I thought
Yeah.
I saw the Zoom link at 6:30. I was sitting by my phone.
No worries, no worries. We are just letting folks stream in, so
Okay. I'm
we're
gonna
just
sit
going to
this
give
up
it a
little
few
so you're not
seconds.
looking up at me.
Okay. For those of you who are here, thank you, welcome, welcome. And we're just going to give it 3 or 4 more minutes to let folks come in. Thanks again. If you're just stopping in, we're just waiting a few more minutes and then we're going to get started. If you're just popping in, we're just going to give it 1 or 2 more minutes and then we're going to get started. Thank you so much for being here. All right, we're going to get started. My name is Rachel Swarns. I'm a journalism professor here at NYU, and I'm so happy to welcome you to this important conversation, race and the midterm elections. We are less than 2 weeks away from the elections that will determine the balance of power in Congress for the next 2 years. And tonight we're going to be talking about how issues of race, ethnicity, and immigration are likely to play out in the outcome. So we've got a great panel of journalists to wrestle with these issues, 4 national correspondents for the New York Times. And it's a bit of a homecoming, at least for me, right? I spent 22 years at the New York Times, so it's pretty fabulous for me to get a gang like this together, all in one room. So I can tell you that it's going to be a treat. And I will start with some introductions. Firstly, we've got Astead Herndon, a national politics reporter for the New York Times, a political analyst for CNN, and he also hosts The Run-Up, a political podcast from the New York Times. Astead, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Jennifer Medina is a national politics reporter at the New York Times, and she covers political attitudes and power with a focus on the West. Hey, Jenny.
Thank you.
Patricia Mazzei is the Miami bureau chief for the New York Times, and she covers Florida and Puerto Rico. Patricia, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
And Maya King is a politics reporter at the New York Times, where she covers the Southeast. And very importantly, she got her journalism degree at my alma mater, Howard University. You know, so happy to have you here, Maya.
Oh, wow. I made the Zoom mistake of talking while on mute. Hello.
All right. We've all done it. Like, there's a little bit of silence there. It's okay. Anyway, I'm so glad that you guys are all here, and we're going to get started. So I want to start with you, Astead. Obviously, America is no stranger to racialized politics, but I think we can all agree that Trump opened the door to a more blatant, explicit brand. He's not on the ballot, of course. So I'm curious, what's the story now? And I know that this week you've been reporting on grassroots Republican voters. And I'm wondering what you're hearing and how issues of race and immigration are playing out for Trump's base.
Yeah, and I first want to say thank you for having me. And also it's great to see, especially this group of panelists, also my favorite reporters. I think that these issues are core to what's happening in the midterms. And that's partly because although Trump isn't on the ballot, certainly his message and the encompassing ideology, I would say, of his presidential campaign certainly is. And that is because Trump endorsed candidates who have taken those messages to the state and local level, won up and down the ballot in the Republican primaries earlier this year. And so you really have in key states a bunch of candidates that are really Trump aslots who are doing his message in those gubernatorial races, and especially in those Secretary of State races. When we talked to grassroots conservatives, it matched up with those results. They were saying that they really see 2020 as a loss of that they are seeking to correct in these midterms. And that was really explicit language. That was when we dug back on where that started from. A lot of it started back in those Obama years with the issue of race. Someone brought up those Trayvon Martin comments and they said drove a racial division in the country. That came up 2 or 3 times in those conversations. Someone brought up the Henry Louis Gates incident, the beer summit from the Obama administration. These were still formative moments for that political construction for the conservatives we talked to this week. And so I don't think that even though Trump isn't on the ballot, certainly the issues and the grievances that are encompassed in his political movement are, and in Republican politics, they're winning.
I was wondering, instead, what about those moments struck those voters? Why did that stick with them, those moments in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a sort of racial blindness to 2008. When you talk to Obama-Trump voters, as we talked to in this episode, the extended part of that conversation, he was saying he thought that voting for Obama in 2008 was really going to end talk about race. And what he saw in those moments were those issues were coming back. And he was then blaming Obama for that. Now, we know that that's not how race functions and that no individual was going to wave a magic wand. But for these Trump voters, that was the first or second thing he said when I asked him how he made the transition from a Democrat in 2008 to a Republican in 2016. He brought that up, and so I think that really speaks to how central those moments were in a lot of these folks' political identity.
Let's jump to you now, Jenny. You were on the Daily a few weeks ago talking about a new poll and what it reveals about Latino voters. And we're in quite a moment now, right? In terms of Latino voters, Trump's made some pretty surprising inroads in 2020, which buoyed Republicans, unsettled Democrats. And in the midterms, it seems like Latinos are poised to have some real impact in 2 Senate races, right? And maybe a dozen competitive House race. And everyone wants to know, where is it going to go? What did you find in your poll, in the poll that you were talking about?
Well, I think what we found is that there's really no way of knowing where it's going to go. Right. And the way it's going to go is that it's going to go differently in different places. Just to pick up on something Astead said, I've spent a lot of time in Arizona where people talk about the wall and immigration constantly. It is one of the go-to things for Republicans, and it's what Blake Masters and Carrie Lake have made completely central to the campaign, to their campaigns, is building the wall. And that completely resonates for Republican voters in Arizona, who are primarily their white voters. But then what you see is that sort of build the wall, to use it as a shorthand. I think a lot of people presume that that would have consequences for Latinos across the country. And in fact, it didn't. It doesn't have, in fact, Latinos in South Texas and South Florida most dramatically shifted toward Trump in 2020 and probably will stay with Republicans this year. But we don't see a similar march to the Republican Party in Arizona or Nevada, two places where Latinos make up like 20% of the population there. So I think what we are really seeing is just how different this is across geographies and how different issues register differently in different segments of the population.
Right, right. And Patty, we were talking about that just earlier this week. Talk a little bit about Florida and where you see kind of Republicans and Democrats in terms of the Latino vote there.
I think the thing Republicans did in South Florida that is useful for Republicans in the rest of the country is that they never gave up on considering Hispanics persuadable group of voters, right? A swing group of voters. And this goes back to the 80s. It's not like a recent thing, but that meant that even when, you know, Hillary Clinton won Miami-Dade County in the 2016 election by almost 30 percentage points, they didn't give up. Instead, they invested more, right? And the party infrastructure has been strong for many years here. They registered more voters, they held civics classes, they reached out more, they sort of doubled down, and we saw Trump lose Dade County, you know, in 2020 by 7 percentage points. And so that's, you know, Dade County just being sort of like the biggest place where there's Hispanics in Florida. And now there's sort of open talk about whether Republicans, or at least Ron DeSantis, will win Dade County. Right. So we're talking about a shift over the past 6 years that is truly remarkable, that I don't think means, to Jenny's point, that we can say this is just what's going to happen forever. If anything, it shows you that it is a swingy population that parties can try to persuade and work for. And the idea, I think, that got Democrats here in trouble was thinking that demographics were going to be destiny and Hispanics were just going to, you know, become more democratic once these sort of older Cuban American Republicans died out. And that's just not what happened. If you sort of spend time with people and educate them and go to meet them where they are, right, which are like the basic things in politics, it yields results. And that's, I think, what we've been seeing here.
Maya, I wanted to go to Georgia, where you have some fascinating races that seem to tell us quite a bit about how the race is playing out in a red state that turned blue. And I'm curious if you could start with the governor's race there and with Stacey Abrams, who is obviously widely credited for pushing Georgia along in that direction. How are things looking there, and what does race and ethnicity look like in terms of how that campaign is going?
Well, it's kind of the story of Georgia, especially this year, where you're having this rematch between Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp. And a couple of things are really being put on the ballot this year. Of course, this is a test of whether or not Democrats have made enough inroads in Georgia to really be competitive atop the ticket. But what's also being tested here is the viability and the strength of the strategy that Abrams has largely been credited with. That is, you know, relying more on voters of color who haven't been widely engaged in places like Metro Atlanta, particularly former Republican strongholds in these counties just outside of Atlanta, and also in these more rural areas where there are large populations of Black and Latino voters who haven't really been engaged. But Abrams and a number of the groups that she founded, a number of the organizers and activists in 2020 found themselves extremely cash flush, and coming off of a summer of protests against systemic racism, had a lot of resources to be able to go after these populations. And I think that's where you saw the political climate shift in Georgia to be able to do things like elect Joe Biden by a very narrow margin, and of course in the runoffs elect 2 Democratic senators. So that kind of put Georgia on the map as a swing state and a major political powerhouse. And now in the governor's race, you have in Abrams kind of the avatar of that strategy against a pretty popular and also very well-funded incumbent in Brian Kemp, who has really run a pretty similarly staunch conservative campaign that he did in 2018 that has appealed to a number of voters as well. So it's kind of, I guess I said two things, but it's really more like three things at work, because you also have this test of just the power of the incumbency up against these different strategies and the woman who represents them.
Are there any, I mean, obviously people are voting, right? Are there any signs yet, you know, in terms of, you know, enthusiasm among, you know, these new voters or newly engaged voters so far?
Oh man, yeah. I mean, early voting in Georgia is really through the roof. So we're now on day 11, I believe, of the early voting period here, and the number of vote ballots cast has now surpassed about 1.1 million people, and so that's well above that same period in 2018, and now quickly approaching the same early vote period that we saw in 2020, where that turnout was also historic. And one group of voters that is really turning out in large numbers that has given Democrats some hope is Black voters, older Black voters in particular. Those are the most loyal faction of the Democratic base, and they are turning out in really large numbers. So that's given a lot of folks, particularly in Abrams' orbit, reason to believe that they really are still in the fight, despite poll numbers that show her lagging between 5 and 10 points behind Brian Kemp.
Okay, and I want to remind our folks who are watching that we're going to be talking for a bit, for maybe about 15 more minutes, and then we're going to be taking your questions. If you have questions, please pop them into the Q&A and keep them coming while we're talking. So Astead, I want to turn back to you. You know, we have a lot of districts now, new districts now, right? Gerrymandered districts. And I'm wondering how that is playing out this time. I know that obviously Democrats argued that the intent was often to dilute the Black vote, the minority vote. What are you seeing? You spent some time in Wisconsin, right?
Yeah, and I think both of those pieces are really important. On the gerrymandering front, you've actually seen Democrats embrace it as a strategy in this redistricting cycle. You know, in a lot of states, they were able to draw out districts that really ensured the Democratic seats. And that's really them playing catch up, because we know that in 2010, what Republicans were able to do there was unique. And in a lot of states, and we focused on Wisconsin specifically, what they were able to draw, not only on the congressional level, but really at the state level, were these unbeatable Republican districts, where as Democrats were eroding among a kind of rural voter, their problems there just got worse and worse. In Wisconsin, even a 50-50 state like that Barack Obama won in 2012, they basically guaranteed that they would maintain a majority at that state assembly and state senate level. That's been true in 2020, and that's probably going to be true this midterm cycle. Already now, no one in Wisconsin thinks it's going to change unless it's going to get more Republican. That's specifically in how they drew the maps. And so what we were trying to focus on is in how that gerrymandering, particularly at the state level, locks in a lot of Republican power and ensures at this moment that Trumpism can't just be blown away, even in this midterms. On that state level, Democrats really have a long road back for what has been them playing catch up to just a Republican advantage of drawing districts where it's very, very difficult for a Democrat to win.
And obviously, and Maya, back to you. Obviously, there were also a lot of laws passed, right, after 2020, intended by states who were hoping to restrict or limit voting in some fashion. You said the folks in Georgia are just lining up. Has it had the impact that people were concerned about?
Well, we can't quite draw any conclusions around the impact of this law yet. The intention essentially was to limit access points to the ballot, but that obviously has not deterred people from still turning out. So you kind of have two sides to this, where particularly Republicans and those in the Secretary of State's office have said, this is not a voter suppression bill, because look at the number of people who have turned out. where a number of folks, particularly in Democratic circles, those who are just widely in favor of expanded access to the ballot, have said that that might not necessarily be the case. I think the provisions of that law that people are most worried about are a few things. One, this provision that allows individuals to challenge other individuals' voter registration. I think that's given a lot of people pause. And then there's this other provision essentially that gives a lot more power to county level officials in how they conduct their elections. And a number of voting rights advocates have told me that that has given them pause because they believe or they fear that in largely Republican-led counties, that could possibly open the door to more disenfranchisement of communities that tend to vote Democratic, particularly voters of color. So I think we're going to just have to wait and see. I'm looking for election day and the days after, and also this runoff period, which will be a lot. If we do go to a runoff in any of these races, the runoff period will be a lot shorter. And those are the things that will just make the election will look really different this year in Georgia than it did in 2018 or even in 2020 for those reasons.
Jenny, with the poll that you were talking about, one of the things you pointed out when you were talking earlier was that, okay, we don't see kind of an exodus, kind of the floodgates opening for Republicans among Latino voters, but you also talked about there being some opportunities there for Republicans to pick up on some problem areas for Democrats potentially. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, if I can go backwards for 1 second. I mean, you see impact of things that are not necessarily law, but voter sort of threats or perception of threats going on right now, even in Arizona, where there hasn't been a lot of talk of the same way that there has been in Georgia, but you've got these poll quote unquote monitors coming with masks and in some cases with guns in the Phoenix suburbs, which are of course primarily Latino neighborhoods. And a lot of these people have been driven out by movies and messages, conspiracy theories that basically allege that there has been, some sort of conspiracy to stuff ballot boxes with primarily, again, Latino voters. In terms of the opportunities, I mean, Patty picked up on this exactly right. Democrats for such a long time have basically relied on Democrats being destiny, and this notion that Republicans were going to repel Latino voters and all Democrats had to do was sit there and be not Republican. And that was going to be enough. And in some cases, it kind of was. It worked to some extent for a little while. But what you see now in our poll and in other polls is how much opportunity there is for Republicans, particularly with young men, and particularly around the issue of the economy and economic opportunity. I think what a lot of these polls show is that Latinos want to be spoken to in some sort of positive way, more than I'm not like them or I'm not racist, but more like, what are you going to do for me? What's the opportunity you're presenting to me? What's your plan to demonstrably make my life any better? I think that's what you're really seeing where the opportunity lies for Republicans across the country, but again, particularly in Texas and Florida, and even in Georgia. I mean, we looked at regions, and the South in general is where Democrats are the most in trouble.
And talk a little bit, the gender gap there is kind of interesting. What's happening there?
I mean, the gender gap is true across all races. I mean, I think we've seen evidence of that in every demographic. I think I'm constantly trying to figure out exactly what's happening there. And I think there's a lot of different things. I think when I think about men that I've spoken to in the South Texas area, I hear all the time this notion of like wanting to provide for your family. And particularly in 2020, there was a sense as things were all shut down with COVID that a sense from these men, like, I'm not able to earn the money to provide for my family. And that I'm going to blame on Democrats. Democrats are the ones shutting the economy down, and they're preventing me from having opportunity. And Trump is a guy who gets it and is going to open the economy, and I can somehow be like him. mean, I hear versions of that wherever I go, and particularly in places where Republicans are doing quite well.
I want to remind folks who are watching, please put your questions in the chat, and our panelists will answer. Astead, I saw you nodding there, I thought, about when I was asking about the gender question, and Jenny was saying, well, I think it's men across the board. Is that the case?
Yeah, totally. I think we see that. I mean, and Donald Trump did much better among white men than he did among white women. He did much better among Black men than he did among black women. I mean, even if that is marginal, we have always seen men vote in bigger numbers for Republicans. And I think, economy's often been an issue that's been brought up, and it's a real one with that kind of sense of provider that Jenny talks about. But I think we also have like a real masculinity backlash right now. I think that like you have a Republican Party that's really embracing those terms and trying to lean into that divide. And I think that like we can, and I think so. There's a lot going on there, but it's certainly a divide that you see across racial groups.
And this perception, fairly or unfairly, that Biden is weak. I hear that all the time. And again, I think that ties into the masculinity perception.
That's interesting. Patty, we talked about Black voters in Florida, North Florida, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, North Florida, in Florida, the saying is the further north you go, the more south you are. So North Florida acts more like the deep south that acts like Miami or Orlando or Tampa. But Duval County, which is where Jacksonville is sort of the swingiest part of North Florida, also the biggest city, actually the biggest city, in the state, if you're just considering, just how big Jacksonville takes up all of Duval County. So it's the biggest city in the state. And we saw it swing in recent elections towards Democrats. It was a place where Obama, who was the last, presidential candidate, Democratic presidential candidate to win Florida, and he won twice, made some real inroads, not by winning Duval County, but by playing for the margins there and sort of like losing by less. And by losing by less in many parts of Florida, he ended up winning Florida, right? But eventually Democrats sort of like, oh, this is an opportunity for us, and like campaigned a lot in Duval County, and it swung in the last couple elections. And Val Demings, who's Congresswoman running for Senate against Marco Rubio, is originally from Jacksonville and has been spending some time there trying to court voters. The issue is, this is still a state that has majority white voters. And so, no matter how many people you turn out in Jacksonville, if you're someone like Val Demings, you sort of still need to make your way around the rest of the state and appeal to all racial groups. And Democratic consultants who I've been speaking to this week are very concerned, to Jenny and Astead's point, about their party's weakness, not only with Hispanics in South Florida in particular, but with Black men. And with Caribbean Americans who in South Florida tend to be Haitian American, Jamaican American, from other parts of the Caribbean, who are sometimes treated by the political parties like African Americans, like they're going to sort of share, democratic, sort of leaning democratic tendencies. And Democrats have been finding over the years that they really act more like sort of just like immigrant groups who care about economic opportunity, who come from more conservative religious backgrounds, who are concerned about, the socialism boogeyman, which is always the big South Florida thing. And they've been struggling among Americans and other Caribbean populations. So, how much can doing well in Jacksonville do for a candidate when you have these other problems? The Democrats here don't sound very optimistic about how they're doing right now with any of those groups.
Right. We had a story, I think, today where there's some concerns being expressed about, how much money the Democrats are putting into that race against Marco Rubio, and whether or not they're supporting Black women in some of these races as much as they should be. Yeah.
What is hard for any Democrat running against Marco Rubio is that he's a Hispanic Republican from Miami-Dade County. And so the math is always going to be very difficult because he is going to, sort of the opposite thing of what Obama did, where he like minimized his losses in North Florida. Someone like Marco Rubio minimizes his losses in South Florida, right? And because South Florida is the bulk of the population of the state, that's the ballgame. So the math is really, really hard for any Democrat running against Marco Rubio, who, by the way, also has like 100% name recognition because he ran for president. So Val Demings, it was probably the only Democrat in Florida right now who could rally a room and like really get people energized and raise all the money that she has raised. And that just might not be enough because of the math.
Gotcha. And Maya, we talked about the governor's race, but you got another race that's pretty interesting. Want to talk about the Senate race there and how that's looking?
Yeah, interesting is an understatement, I think, for this race. You have two entirely different people, entirely different personalities and approaches to policy, and also two Black men. And so you have sort of the partisan politics at work, but also racial politics. Herschel Walker is a former University of Georgia football player who won the Heisman, has massive name recognition in Georgia as an athletic phenom, but is a political newcomer who came into this race just saddled with all kinds of personal drama and real scandal, including domestic violence and a number of other kind of alarming details. And has made it his approach to race, though. I mean, his crowds are largely white, and he has talked to his supporters saying, we all are from a different background, and you should not feel bad for being white. And he even has gone so far as to apologize for what he perceives are falling short of Black men and Black communities, and has tried to tie a contrast of that between Raphael Warnock's approach. Warnock is the incumbent Democrat, is the senior pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church, has a really storied background. Of course, that was Martin Luther King's church, and is a really kind of clean cut, very just straight and narrow candidate. And his approach has been to preach both from the pulpit, but also on the campaign trail, and has talked a lot about not only what he's done in his short time in the Senate, but also, has talked widely about the perceived failings of America as it relates to people of color. And so, it's just, I could go on and on about the way that these men have just totally, it's like you have two different visions for what Georgia is and what it could be through this race. And it's still anyone's to win. Right now, we're kind of bracing ourselves for the possibility that it could go to a runoff. And that, again, will take us into totally different territory, but it's really been a fascinating one to follow.
Are Republicans hoping, we were talking a little bit about gender and how that's been playing out in some of these contests. Are Republicans hopeful that Herschel Walker can draw Black men or peel enough away?
I believe that when Herschel entered the race, they thought that because he is a Black man, he would draw Black support. And Herschel himself has said, I think I'll win the Black vote, but that has not at all come to pass. I think, in conversations that I've had with Black voters in Georgia, a number of them just don't really feel like Walker represents who they are. A number of them are a little embarrassed by some of the things that he said in public, the way that he sounds when he speaks on the stump, the fact that he hasn't really put forth any real tangible policy proposals that have anything to do with people of color, and the fact that all of his senior staff is white and male. So I think the GOP just went into this with kind of a straw man argument that representation equals votes here, but Black voters in Georgia are just smarter than that, and Herschel Walker has not given them much to vote for.
You mentioned too, when we were talking just a minute ago about Latino and Asian voters and the voters who Stacey Abrams was trying to bring in. You mentioned to me that many voters are single issue voters in Georgia, but that's not really the case with many of these voters. And it sounds like you're putting your finger down that there with that Senate race. What were you talking about? What did you mean when you said that?
Well, I might actually walk back that claim, because I don't think that most voters in this race are single issue voters, particularly if we're talking about voters of color. But
no, that's what I meant. That's what I meant. In fact, that you were saying that voters of color are not.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that every election for voters of color is often put in these terms of this is the election that can decide your future. And voters of color are not only they're thinking about the economy like all other voters, but I think through a number of different lenses, not just inflation, but being able to provide for their families and being able to achieve, especially in the case of Black men, equal economic status, especially for those who are business owners or aspiring to be. I think, when the Dobbs decision came down, that was a big topic. And I was talking to a lot of Black voters, particularly in rural Georgia, about that issue, wondering if that was something that may interfere with their vote in November. And I didn't speak to a single voter who said, yes, abortion is the thing that I'm voting on in these rural Black communities. Because one, abortion is tied to this belief in bodily autonomy. There's widespread distrust among a number of Black voters in the healthcare system and whether or not they'll be treated equally there. And they were saying there are a number of other issues that are more front of mind for me. And so that let me know that for Black voters in Georgia, especially the ones that I was talking to, there is not one single issue that is going to decide this election, but what they are rather unified in is which party they believe will get them closer to at least actualizing some of these policy goals. And by and large, that has been the Democratic Party.
Okay. I'm wondering, and remember, folks who are watching, please put your questions in the Q&A because we're going to be moving to that shortly. Are there, and I'm going to just throw this out to you guys, what are the races to watch, would you say, right now, where voters of color are poised to have a significant impact? I know, Jenny, you were talking about some races in the West. I don't know if you can point us to ones where you think it would be worth watching.
Yeah, so the two big statewide is Nevada and Arizona. In both of those races, Latinos make somewhere in the ballpark of close to somewhere between 15 and 20% of the voters, depending on how many people turn out. And also all of those congressional races, because obviously what happens at the top of the ticket will affect the congressional races, and they could control the House, determine the control of the House. There's also a bunch of competitive races where Black, Asian, Latino voters will be a decisive factor in California. And then, of course, there's also South Texas and South Florida, which we've talked about already. I think there's races all across the country because the map of competitive races is actually quite big this year. There's so many races where these different groups are really can play a decisive role. And because if Republicans peel off enough support, they could win. They don't necessarily have to win a majority of Latino voters or majority of Black voters, but if they peel back enough support or get those voters to stay home even, they could win.
Astead, you're nodding.
Yeah, no, I've been nodding the whole time. I think I feel like that's a great point. I mean, I think that the map is really vast. I love the point Patty made specifically around the differences between Caribbean men, African American men, and the uniqueness, even when we talk about Black men as a group. And I feel like it's a similar story here, where we're largely talking about specifically a Democratic Party that had the ideal of a multiracial coalition without the actual complicated part. And they are just now getting to the work of doing, to understanding that people want to be spoken to differently, and and folks have different priorities and they come from different places. And I think that we are, and I think that this, that hearing this range of things from Georgia to Texas to California really just puts that in perspective, because that answer is true. There is races all across the country where this stuff is at the center. And we know it's at the center for a lot of white voters also, and what we have done this week is talk to people who talk about the demographic changes in the country as really as being motivating for them too. So I really think these issues are everywhere.
When you say motivating, oh, go ahead, Patty.
No, I was going to say, I don't think Florida is that competitive this year, which is a strange thing to be saying in Florida after many years of it being competitive. But if we see blowouts, which is possible by, in the statewide races with Ron DeSantis for governor, Marco Rubio for Senate, it will have been in no small part because of help from Black men or Hispanic voters, you don't get a blowout in this state if you don't have groups like that going for you. Otherwise, it all stays in the margins. And so I think it's also important to look at it that way, right? Like in the places where the races are not all that competitive, why not? Because it in some cases, because these groups sort of like went clearly, at least in this cycle, toward one candidate or one party over the other. And so I think we need to sort of remember that, like if you get a 10-point victory or an 8-point victory, a 6-point victory in Florida, which in recent cycles has all been like 1 to 3 point margins, it's news not because it's suspenseful. It's news because suddenly there's like a vast gulf, right? And the reason we know, besides public opinion polls, that it might be happening is, for example, today Republicans overtook Democrats in early ballots turned in. And in this state, Republicans vote on election day, and Democrats vote early. And so usually Democrats go into election day with a big sort of like reserve of their voters having gone to the polls. And if Republicans are starting to turn it around at this early stage, there might be no sort of like turning back from that. So I just wanted to say, like, the groups matter also in the places that are not competitive, but that are certainly interesting because they're not competitive.
So when you were talking about the demographics and demographics being a motivator, demographic change being a motivator for Republican voters, concern about demographic change, or what
Absolutely,
were you referring
the
to? Yeah.
backlash to it. I mean, we heard that all the time about, and I mean, and it's not a false thing. The country has changed. You know, cultural power in the country has changed. Demographic shifts are real and happening. I mean, I think that like we can sometimes act as if that is, you know, that those voters are responding to the abstract. But it was a view, and this was really tied to the democracy stuff we talked to these folks with. A guy who is in our episode today says very specifically that 50+1 democracy is unworkable for him because Democrats have these cities where people of color are going to outnumber them. He said there was another person who said the have-nots will be the majority. I mean, this is not a passive thing for many of the base voters on the Republican side. This is something that is spoken about in Republicans and in kind of Trumpy media and in grassroots Republican circles. It is not, you know, it's not something that is even them. Even when I ask the question, they're very comfortable with answering.
Yeah, so no one's whispering.
No, it's not a secret. I mean, Blake Masters has been campaigning for months on great replacement theory. And, you know, that's a state that had turned Democratic in large part because of Latino voters. Like, to some extent, he has a point. I mean, it is not a Democratic, it's not a
secret
point.
Cabal.
Right, it's not a secret cabal, but it is true that the demographics have changed the political makeup of that state. And now the question is like, are you going to see the revenge of the white voters with white grievances? I mean, I think that's what Astead is kind of alluding to there. I hear it all the time. I mean, that is a central factor in these people who are supporting Kari Lake and Blake Masters, this feeling of being overtaken in their own state.
I want to, one last question before we turn to the Q&A, and that is, you know, we're at NYU, we care about politics, but, you know, students here care about the journalism too. And a lot of them are looking and watching and saying, you know, we'd love to be doing what you're doing. And I'm wondering if you could just talk just very briefly about any advice that you would offer young journalists, young students, soon to be young journalists who would like to sit where you sit right now.
I can start. I think, no shade, I think I'm the closest to college age on this panel.
I think this is the first time in the panel that I haven't had to take that role. So I really appreciate this time.
All right, we'll give that to you. Go ahead. Yeah.
I'll just say start now. I mean, the thing that makes great journalists is great curiosity. And I mean, you're at NYU and you're in New York, many of you. So just, I mean, look around and look for the stories that you can tell now and the people that you can start talking to now. I think the one thing I wish I had done more when I was in college was get in the habit of just talking to people and just like walking up to people or picking up the phone. Of course, now being a journalist forces you to do that all the time. But, you know, when you're in college, you have the great benefit of just kind of being super wide-eyed and saying like, I am a student and I want to learn more. And that just makes people want to just explain everything to you. And you never know, those people could go on to actually be really valuable sources in the future. So I would just say, like, don't take the fact that you are a student for granted, because you have a great opportunity now to kind of get a head start on the things you want to do most.
Yeah, I would say a plus one to that. I would say really care about truth in a kind of like in a kind of like, you know, college essay way. I'm like, I actually think that that is what drives. I mean, to your point about curiosity, like whether you want to be, what type of journalism you want to do, like if you are really driven by the idea of getting to fact and that really matters for people, you can do that across so many different types of journalism. And that is really, I think, what people really care about, is that curiosity, is that perspective, and is in pushing people to new information and new perspectives. And that's not going to come through in your work unless you legitimately enjoy that. And I feel like legitimately find value in that. And I think when you talk to people, they will sense if you really find value in that too. And so I would just say, like, believe in your curiosity. Don't fake it.
I like to tell people that you don't immediately start out in the job you want or that you think you want. But two things to that. There is value to starting in, covering a city hall somewhere, being a cops reporter, being a courts reporter, covering local churches, schools, whatever sort of gets you in the door. You don't realize it until later, what the variety and the things you learn by just doing a beat gives you, and just being thrown in and trying to learn a bureaucracy, a place, a city, and the people who run it. I think there's fewer of those local journalism jobs now, but they're like going to graduate school, right? Like in real life. And so to find the value in that, even if it's not where you eventually want to end up. And then if you do have an idea of a job that you want once you are working, you know how they tell you to dress for the job you want and not the job you have, write for the job you want. So if you see an opening on a subject matter or a beat or an event or a press conference that you can sort of step into and show that, oh, I'm not covering politics right now, but I can go do something for politics and they can see me in that role. You sort of create the jobs for yourself and the opportunities for yourself that way.
Okay, Jenny gets the last word.
I'm the oldest millennial on here. I think I like barely squeak in on the millennial front. I think mine is doesn't even count. And so maybe the people who are listening don't need this advice, but as the old fogey, I did, to just really both trust your instinct and be radically open at the same time. I think for me, I'm coming up on 20 years at the New York Times. I started right after college. And for me, it was a very hard place to trust my instinct. I sort of looked around and thought everybody else knew more than me. And to some extent, that is true. But to some extent, your life experience actually has a lot to offer. And you need to be aware of that and own that and embrace that. And I think, I deeply admire young people who come with more confidence than I think I had starting out.
Wonderful. All right, so let's get to these questions that we've got. Okay, so Tony Odejimi says, in terms of Georgia and its race, what is a perspective or an angle to the Abrams-Kemp or anyone on the down ballot race that's been underrepresented in terms of young voters? Okay, are there certain intricacies about this election that young voters aren't getting that a student journalist could report on? What are we lacking in terms of fully reporting on this race? Okay, someone sees an opportunity there, Maya. What?
I'm so glad you asked this. No, I'm actually really glad this person asked this, because I am supposed to file a story on young voters very soon.
Great.
And I mean, I think that they're not widely talked about because they're often written off as a block that doesn't really turn out very much and can't really make a difference. But we've all said tonight in many different ways that in these competitive races, they do come down to the margins. And so when you're talking about like a margins game, young voters and turning them out, or at least juicing the turnout with them, I think is one of the ways that Democrats are trying to try to win at the margins, quite frankly. One thing that I would encourage you to pay attention to, because you were asking if there's like a student angle here or something that a student can go after, is what Biden's move to try to relieve student loan debt a few weeks ago could do for the young vote. I think it's a really interesting question to explore, to see if that plays a role in anybody's desire, especially voters under 30, to turn out where they might not have before, or just like this ongoing narrative around young voters that they have to see results, to turn out. Is this the result that gets them to turn out in these competitive races?
Great. We've got another question. And I think we all have heard concerns about this. And the question is about the media and how the media depicts racism in politics, okay? And the question is, I'd like to hear why all of you avoid alarming language about the central role of racism and intolerance in Republican support. Would your editors cut it out if you put it in?
Well, I'll take this in audio, I feel that I understand this question. I mean, this is a question we get often, right? Like, and I have like two perspectives here that people can agree or disagree with. Like, I think that to clearly present and indict something does not require certain language. Like, I did stories about white identity politics all throughout 2019. I went to Trump stock, I went to St. Cloud, I went to people who are explicitly articulating racist language, right? And I did not put calling them racist in the story, right? I don't think anyone would be confused with the idea of what we have presented. And I often think that for me, any type of description like that is just a reporting question. Like, if I actually get in a interview or in talking to someone, get language that is clear enough and put it in, I don't actually need the descriptor, whether on one side or the other. And I think I would encourage folks to read that story and to see if you think that lets up on that stuff. I also think that, like, this is true across words a long ways. And certainly in working at a place like the New York Times, we are, I can certainly, in our show right now, there are things we did not air from grassroots conservatives this week. And that was a decision we made as a team. I did a story about racism in the fire department last year, where we published some text messages and not the others. I don't think that there's any value in gratuitous use of something if you do the framing and reporting work where it is clear either way. And I think that's a big if. And I think it's up to us, like, journalistically, to live up to the challenge of that if. But I think that that's how I view it.
Okay. Another Georgia question. I saw this Twitter post that said the media is not giving equal time to Warnock in comparison to Walker. What do we do with that? Is the media potentially giving more attention to Walker going to be a substantial factor in the race?
I think about this question a lot because I wonder just how much value sometimes how our readers might be served by all of this Walker drama, especially those who don't live in Georgia. But the truth is that Walker is a candidate unlike anyone has ever seen in this way, running for the United States Senate. And I think it's hard because it's important to lay out all of the different ways that this man has kind of contradicted himself, or, committed these kind of personal, trying to be diplomatic in the way that I say this, but like the ways that he's sort of stepped outside of himself. I'm talking about the domestic violence, paying for a woman's abortion after saying that he is against abortion. I mean, these are important stories, I think, for people to know, for someone who is running for the United States Senate, but it does also make it difficult because we haven't covered Warnock nearly as closely and, with as much scrutiny. But as far as we know, Warnock doesn't have these skeletons in his closet. I was just texting with someone who is also in the press pool for Georgia, who was wondering the same thing. Essentially, have we given too much oxygen to Walker? And is that actually helping him in the end because he has all of this kind of free press? I think we'll know in November, what that might do, because there's the argument to be made that people need to know about this. And this is a candidate who has a lot of issues. And then there's also but are we giving oxygen to just sort of tabloid style personal life stories that might not matter in the end? And I don't know the answer to that yet, but would welcome anyone else to weigh in.
I mean, I think the oxygen question goes beyond Walker and Warnock and Georgia too. I mean, I'm thinking about Carrie Lake, who is such a telegenic star and has now had all these sort of fawning profiles written about her. And, you know, I think this is like, are we doing the same thing that we did with Trump in 2016? I mean, I think this is something we have to sort of constantly be thinking about and calibrating and recalibrating, and how, you know, and how do you deal with the reality that sometimes some candidate is more interesting, just sort of has more interest, reader interest, and has sort of more drama to it than the other. I mean, I just don't think it's a clear-cut answer.
I also think that there's a risk of the flip side too. When you avoid that stuff too much,
Yes.
you also do people a disservice. And so I think in a place like Arizona, I'm thinking about something like birtherism, which like I think was massively undercovered as a movement, particularly because of uncomfort around race, identity, and those type of, and conspiracy theory. And I think that causes us to miss things like, you know, Donald Trump's political cachet before he even gets into the race. And so I think it is such a hard line to balance. It's not even just that one side. I think there's a risk of undercovering it too.
Absolutely.
Someone has a question about an identity question, really, and about kind of how Latinos in particular might see themselves and looking at kind of American classifications and kind of where Latinos fit, and maybe how does this play out in a political sense. And so the viewer is asking, very curious about how people are classified. You know, are Latinos more and more frequently listed as white? The question isn't specifically, well, no, but how does that play out? Yeah, in terms of politics, which is what we're talking about here.
I think I've given some thought to this in Miami, because there has always been I think more than at the national level, more explicit separation here for whatever reason between race and ethnicity, and the fact that you can be white Hispanic or Black Hispanic or whatever, you know, various combinations of race and ethnicity. Whereas in other parts of the country, you know, they would sort of bulk Latino as a race, or, you know, and people would be like, especially when you grow up here and like sort of seeing like, well, race is one thing, ethnicity is another. Why do I have to pick one thing when I'm both of these things, right? I actually remember this came up in 2016 with the presidential race. I don't remember what document it had been, if it was a voter registration or a driver's license, that Marco Rubio had said he was white. And there was like this whole uproar nationally. And, you know, I worked at the Miami Herald at the time, and we were like, he is white. You know what I mean? Like, he is a white Latino. I think he's a white Hispanic, like, or this is Miami, this is how people identify. I don't know what it means in sort of to the viewer's question about more broadly how that plays out in politics and finance. But Astead's point earlier was a good one about how people like to be talked to where they are and about how they feel about themselves, and not being lumped together as whatever, a person of color, a minority, an immigrant. And you can have those, you know, you have those two identities, you're white Hispanic, you're Black Hispanic, whatever it is. And I think the ability to sort of see how people can be many things at once is now sort of playing out more in other places than just here. And that's what we're seeing. I don't know what it means sort of like in the long term, but the viewer is right that in the census, you know, we saw in the last census, which had all the problems that it had, we still saw more people. For example, I also cover Puerto Rico, right, who are identifying as Black for the first time. They're also Hispanic, but they're Afro-Puerto Ricans. And they were, you know, Jenny and I had lots of discussions about this too in Florida and Puerto Rico, that there was just a lot of people being like, oh, we are both of these things and we should be able to say it now, you know, which I think is fascinating, and just really goes into like people, how they grew up and what they identified as and what their parents told them they were in their school and their community, and sort of coming to terms as adults in many cases to like, oh, I am also this, you know, and it's okay, and like embracing their full identity. So I think it's fascinating.
But I think if I could just jump in, I think this kind of gets to the geographic differences and the way in which race is so different in different parts of the country. I mean, Patty and I have talked a lot about this over the years. I mean, I live in LA and cover mostly the West, and most Latinos that I talk to do not consider themselves white and are not treated as white in most of the places that I am covering. It's just not how race is talked about here. And I think in this country, for very obvious reasons, we think about things in a black-white paradigm that seems to have had a much tighter grip on Miami than it does, say, in LA. And I think it factors out really differently. The census is actually really interesting because there was actually fewer people who got identified as white only in the census this year. And just this question of like how we treat Hispanic, Latino identity is so complicated in this country. We sort of think about it in race as a race in some contexts, and then other contexts, it's an ethnicity. And there's this other interesting thing going on on the left, where there's a bunch of Latinos who want to say, I have white privilege because of the way I look. And I just think this is all getting sorted out and still a very much a live topic, and how it influences politics, I think, is really, really complicated and interesting. I think we just don't know the answer.
Yeah, and here I often, among my students, I hear that, you know, Latino students will say, well, I'm white passing, and because of that, I have this kind of privilege and this kind of experience, which is different. And it's, you know, people are obviously wrestling with all of this. Last question from one of the first folks to ask a question, saying, moderator, that's not what I meant. And so the question wasn't whether or not we as journalists kind of declare, okay, that's racist. The concern that this viewer has is that, and here's the question, why don't you sound more alarmed about the central role of racism? You are alarmed, right?
I have been Black every day of my life. Race has been race has been
We're
central. Race has been central to every day of my existence. You know, like the idea that race in politics is something that is explicitly new is wild. Race in politics is a core foundation of the country, it's a core understanding. I mean, we're thinking about this stuff, right? Like when we think about why hasn't the Democratic Party caught up to the idea that specifically Latino voters can come from different places or not have a monolithic experience, I think that's because they extrapolated wrong lessons from African-American votes for way too long. I think that that's because of Democratic primary, where Black voters have specifically controlled the primary for years. I mean, I think that like, I don't sound alarmed because I think that particularly in the last 20 years, race has been the foundational fault line of a lot of identity politics. I mean, we have seen that grow, but I guess, what am I supposed to be? I'm confused that mine, you know, like I think-
It doesn't feel new.
I do think it's core.
It's more explicit, yeah, more explicit, but not new. Okay, well, I want to, someone said, preach, Brother Astead. Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And I want to thank all of our panelists here. We are going to be obviously watching your coverage and watching what happens in November. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Take care now.